So who enjoyed that, by the way? Was that good? No? Oh, we'll come back to you in a minute. No, it'll be fun. Can you see these principles beginning to work in practice? Right? Can you start seeing them interacting, playing out in front of you in little gestures and little things they say or do, or even things that you feel and experience yourself? Would that be fair to say? Yeah. The next thing to do, if you want to think like a true master hypnotist, is what happens when you start combining the principles. For example, there's a couple of you guys pulled me over for problem clients, right? What if you combine the contrast? Contrast is how we can tell what's happening in the world, right? If there is no contrast, we would be deaf, we would be dumb, we would be blind, we would be without sensation. It's the contrast that allows you to have something. If you doubt me, who here has a wristwatch, right? Who here feels their wristwatch on day-to-day activities, right? It's because there's no contrast. Who here feels it when they take their wristwatch off again after a while, right? Doesn't it feel kind of weird and empty? It's the contrast that you're feeling because your body's become acclimatized to something. Does that make sense? Now, what if the contrast that someone's making is what's in terms of what's not working, right? I'm not really that relaxed and I've got pain in the back of my head. What are they looking for as contrast points? Anyone? Is that going to enhance the trance experience or not? It's maybe discomfort. Basically, you're contrasting against the critical factor, against things to reject experiences. Does that make sense? So if you mix the contrast principle with a critical factor, what do you have? You've got a great block to hypnosis, which kind of answers your question once again from earlier on, right? What if, however, and by the way, there's a reasonable proportion of people who will do this instinctually. It's their learning style, right? It's not a bad thing. It's they learn by contrasting against information on what's not working and what's wrong and what isn't right and so on. Does that make sense? But is that going to help you put them in trance? So, what would you want to contrast against? Would it not be fair to say that if they're contrasting agreement against what they can accept, that suddenly the whole thing turns around, right? So as a rule, if someone comes up to you and says, it's not working, or I can't be hypnotized, someone's tried before and it hasn't worked, there's a couple of things that can be going wrong. Number one, probably the context wasn't set in the first place, right? So they had a poor hypnotist who did a rush job. The other possibility is the one the number 2 on the list, is that they're contrasting, they're looking for the wrong information, right? They're having an experience, it's just by every time they have the experience, because they're contrasting against what's not working, they're actually using their trance to reinforce not going into one. Do you see how that works? Now, how might one switch the principle around so it's working in your favor?
Can you make an association?
Can you make an association is the question? An association to what? I'll come to you in a second.
The more you focus on the problems, the deeper in the trance you go.
So the more you focus on the problem, the deeper in trance you go. It can do, except if they're still using that with a critical factor, the association might not take.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's something worth playing with, absolutely. And I'll show you how to elaborate that, which is a lot of fun. But as long as you keep that in the back of your mind, it's worth a test. And if it doesn't work out, you'll know where to go next, right? Go ahead.
Redirect your focus to something you have to agree with, including breathing or blinking.
She's a good one. You have to redirect their experience to something they have to agree with. For example, breathing, blinking, and that sort of thing, right? But I'd like to go one step further. Why? Because if all they're doing is they're redirecting something they have to agree with, like you're blinking, they go, sure. But if mentally they're adding something, but it doesn't mean anything, right? It's that but we have to get rid of somehow. Does that make sense? So what if we get them to contrast against something that is working no matter how small? Because there's one thing we know absolutely for a fact. There is no homeostasis in terms of an absolute experience that is unaltering and unchanging. We are constantly in flux, constantly relaxing more or creating more tension, right? It cycles. Even in trance, remember, the trance is not perfectly level. It'll cycle, even though it might tend towards a direction. Does that make sense to you guys? So the answer is, if you get them to contrast against that portion of the cycle where it's already working, they can't deny that experience of it having worked a little bit. Does it make sense? Now, of course, if they're really true hardcore testers, which is, again, it's a good learning style, it's a useful thing in some environments, they'll say, yes, but it's not enough, right? So if that happens, what might you say at that point? How might you handle that? Just using the principles we know so far. Or any other principles, I really don't mind. This is increasing. Well, you're very close. You can actually go, I actually would go with that first of all and see if it takes, and otherwise add something extra. Go on.
Agreeing with them, saying it shouldn't be enough.
Agreeing with them, it shouldn't be enough. You're so close, right? This is coming into more what we'll deal later with in terms of frame control. We may as well give you guys a little chance. Go on.
Well, beyond enough, what would
Okay, going down to mind-bending language, beyond enough or would be enough. That's another approach, which actually would work great at that point, but we're not handling mind-bending language here, so I'm going to use a slightly different approach. Go ahead.
like a takeaway?
A little takeaway, like, you can't have it.
Yeah, I guess you just can't feel the comfort and relaxation. Something like that.
A takeaway like I guess you can't feel the comfort of trance and so on. Now, that'll work great with a certain type of personality. Again, you have to read the person. Some people will feel dejected. If there's dejection, if they don't feel good enough, and that's part of the pattern that's creating the contrast, you don't want to use that because you're going to feed into their pattern of like, I'm not good enough. If on the other hand, they're challenge-oriented, they're going to go, I'll show you, buddy. So again, do you see how you have to be able to read the interaction very carefully to see where we're going with this? Go ahead.
Couldn't you integrate it by telling them the discomfort is part of the process?
So we can integrate it so the discomfort is part of the process? Absolutely. Allow me just to put you out of your misery to some extent. By the way, this is great. The ideas you guys are coming up with, all of them will work with a certain context. The key idea we're trying to get towards is, right, what's the key problem when someone says, well, I've relaxed a little bit, but it's not hypnosis, but it's not good enough. What's the key problem there? It's not enough. It's not good enough. They're denying their own experience as being the right experience, right? So you've got to switch that key idea around. So I really like where you were going with this because you were so close. What if it says like, that's right, it's not enough yet. Or we're not there yet. What does the yet allow them to do? Right. So it allows them to delay the testing, the contrasting with the failure until later. And something happens with time. There's a nice little bit of research in terms of time, which is when things happen in the present moment, people look for effort. In other words, they look with how much it costs them to do this particular thing, right? So for example, if I said to you guys, who wants to buy my next course right now? You're going to go like, oh, great, how much does it cost? Right? That's probably the uppermost on your mind. If I say to you, next year, I'm going to release a course on basically making hypnosis like 10 times easier. It's not ready yet. Who would be interested in that? Right? So what's happening right now is by projecting to the future, in the future, people tend to focus on the benefits of something. Make sense? Now is the cost, future is the benefit. It's just part of how most people tend to think. So if you can delay their testing to the future, that's what the word yet is doing. It's not the word is all powerful, it's what it does inside the person. If you can delay them testing it until afterwards, they're doing two things. Number one, they're no longer looking at the present cost. The present cost being, is this not working? The effort involved. What do I have to do to make this work? Right? Number two, you're switching their yes mind on because in the future they're looking for benefits. And you're switching it on in the present moment, which means now the contrast is more likely to work. Now, these are all, of course, tendencies. We're stacking the deck. But do you see where we're going with this? Do you see how mixing principles together can give you a hell of a lot of leverage when doing hypnosis? Does that kind of make sense to you guys? This is important because when doing formal hypnosis, you will come across a certain percentage of people who have those very mindsets, and you need to be able to get through that. In a conversation, it might be easier to put someone in trance because they don't know that it's not working, right? Because you're not doing anything. So they can succeed before they realize that anything's happened. But that even then, if you spot the same pattern, you need to know how to break it. And the way you break it is very simply by getting them to contrast against success. And if you need to, project them into the future where they'll put their testing in. And in that way, you're setting them up for looking for benefits, for looking for successes rather than looking for failures. Do you see how that cycle works? It's kind of involved, but the good news is there'll be people in this room that don't think hypnosis is working for them, right? Please try and find them, and be gentle when you do, because you don't want to break them straight away of that habit. Someone else may want to have a go too, right? So be polite. Go ahead. So the question is, if they're contrasting things, are you really bypassing their mind? There's a difference between analysis and contrast, right? You can't experience anything without contrast. If you put, for example, a little dot right on the pupil of the eye, where the light goes in, within, I don't know if it's 30 seconds or 60 seconds, your eye will delete it. Your brain will no longer see that dot. Why? Because the image moves with the iris, so it just deletes it. You cannot have any sensation. That's what sensory deprivation thanks to and all that sort of stuff, right? So the unconscious mind still needs contrast. It's just we're not evaluating the contrast. We're not analyzing it. The second thing you need to realize is that trance is not an on or off switch. It's a sliding process, right? So at the beginning, you'll have a lot of conscious activity and some unconscious activity that's suppressed to the conscious stuff. So then you have the next stage will be conscious activity slows down, unconscious activity is enhanced, but it's more by permission of the conscious mind. And over time, the roles reverse. Consciousness is at some level absent. The experience is still there. They may still have memory, but they'll go with the experience more smoothly. And that's the sliding scale that you'll be going through. And in a conversation, it's rare that you reach that bottommost level where everything just becomes absolute reality. And you don't want it to either, because it skews the conversation in ways you don't necessarily want to have, right? So it's a sliding scale, and you want to be able to work at each level of that scale rather than just at the end of it. Does that make sense? Everyone cool? You liking this? Yeah. Do you notice how, I mean, let's face it, the exercises are pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? Would it be fair to say? Now, do you notice how there's a lot inside them in terms of anything you do that's hypnotic is packed with principles, and those are the things I want you to pay attention to, because the principles make hypnosis actually, and the principles make conversations hypnotic. Make sense? There's one last thing I just want to add, just very quickly. We don't need to spend much time on it, but now is the time to do it before we come back after lunch. Stuff has to happen in the brain in order for anything to occur, whether it's hypnotic or anything else. Hypnosis is not a magic formula. Hypnosis is not instant success. Hypnosis is a process, and it has to be processed by something. So you need to sometimes give them time to process. Now, ironically, it depends on what you're doing. The mental processing principle, shall we say, says that you've got to just pause and give people a chance to absorb the suggestion, absorb the idea, right? All too often do I hear people rushing through suggestions and none of it sticks because it's just too much. But of course, you can see clearly that this will go against another principle we've already talked about, haven't we? The overload principle. So which one's right? Exactly. It's just a question of when. Goes right back down to what is the context? What's going on right now? What do you want to go on? Right? You overload primarily to bypass the critical factor. Primarily. Right? You allow mental processing time primarily to stimulate the unconscious. So sometimes you'll start by overloading, and once you've got to that right point, then there's this beautiful moment of pause where the suggestion just rests and it sinks in. And then you might go back to overloading again, just as consciousness becomes more active, and you can repeat the cycle. You can fractionate those cycles just as anything else. Does that make sense to you guys? This is very important because we are moving at a relative pace here. And I don't want you to think that it's all going to be speed hypnosis instantly, now. Because conversations do take their time. And there's some things you'll have to place in very carefully in one conversation that you won't even play with until maybe a few weeks or months have passed. And because we're looking at the long term here right now, right? It just depends on what the relationship is like, what the situation is like, what you're doing, and so on. Does that make sense to you guys? So principles work. Sometimes certain principles, when put together, will make it work less. For example, the contrast versus the critical factor. And if that happens, just find out what is the dynamics going on inside that person, and then you can start switching it around. Does that make sense? Any questions on that as ideas go? The important thing is, these principles, I want you to refer them back to something you've actually done or experienced. Has anyone here presented to you, even just today, a suggestion that came too soon? Like you didn't quite know what to do with it yet. Anyone have that experience? Right? That's the mental processing part. Some people, and by the way, sometimes resistance is just the hypnotist going too quickly. Anyone here have a sense at some point that you were thinking too much and you'd followed too easily and then they weren't really leading you all that well? Anyone? Right? That's the absence of overload. The balance points have to be found between for each individual at different levels, and that's where we'll come on to tomorrow when we start talking about reading people and so on. You all felt yourselves being led by someone who, like, you felt competent, you just wanted to follow along, right? And you felt some people who you didn't feel safe in their hands, who didn't really know what they were doing. You felt like, I don't know about this stuff, I'll just make it up and pretend to go along with it, but nothing's really going on. That's the authority principle, right? So I want you to take all these principles and refer it back to something that's occurred to you, actually happened to you, something you've actually done. Because after the break, we're going to come on to the language. And we'll play with lots of different language games, and initially they won't have much purpose other than to get used to the language. But the important thing is, when we start applying the language is absolutely irrelevant. Let me re-emphasize this. The language is absolutely irrelevant. In fact, it's counterproductive unless it's expressing these principles for you. If it's expressing these principles, then the language makes sense. Because whether you're using power words or trance words or whatever it is you want to be playing with, it's doing something for you now. Something very purposeful. If, on the other hand, you're just throwing those words out because that's what the course said you should do, and you should read the script out and all the rest of it, then sometimes it will work, and sometimes it will not. The times it will work is when you've accidentally got the right context and all these things are working for you. Beautiful. The times it will not is when somehow accidentally you have violated an important principle, and you can't fix it until you start looking at the interaction and asking yourself, what principle is missing? Does that make sense to you guys? So as you go to lunch, I'd like for you guys to do two things if we could. Number one, reflect on your experiences here this morning and see how you can attach one of these principles to at least one experience that you've had so far. Does that make sense? This was an example of someone having good authority. Or this is an example when I had a good authority relative to the person I was working with. Right? Here is an example when I got good compliance, or when I didn't. Right? Contrasting those things. Right? Go through each one on the list and find at least one or maybe two or three reference experiences. And then the next thing I want you guys to do is think about, how might I do this in a normal conversation? Now, don't try and do anything with it. I mean, if you really have to, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to be there at lunch looking over your shoulder, right? But observe normal conversations. Have a chat to someone and go, hang on a second. Was that a little bit of an authority thing going on here? Am I agreeing with him a bit? Is this agreement going on well? Is he agreeing with me? Is he complying with these ideas? Did I have it for a while and then lose it? Which would be the contrast principle alerting you to what's going on. Do you see how that works? I'd like you to really take the time to have conversations, get to know each other over lunch. But in the back of your mind, I want you to filter for these principles, because you'll see they happen. They cannot not happen. If there's another human being present, it will happen at one level or another. Does that make sense? Yep. And then when we come back from lunch, we'll start playing with the language, but it'll now be in a context that's actually useful. All right, guys? Thanks, guys. Off you go.